have Francis Marion in them. And there's a movement afoot now to raise the money to build Marion Square in DC, build a heroic statue of Francis Marion there. And it is the most convoluted and obscene process to do something like that in Washington, D.C. And the group who is sponsoring it, headed by John McCabe, who is from Columbia, got a law passed by the United States Congress saying that it was okay to do that. And you would think that if Congress passes a law saying it's okay, then it would be a done deal. That is so far from the truth. It is the more boards and commissions and bureaucrats and groups that are involved in it. And so we are working our way through that tangled mass of approval process, and it's well underway. I think that the next person or the next group that has to sign off on it is the National Park Service. There's been recently, within the last month, hearings in the actual neighborhood, and I'm disgusted and sorry to say that the only objection that came up about it was someone who was quoting a quote in the newspaper that from British historian Piers Maxey, basically quoting Wikipedia. Now, whether Piers Maxey is accurately quoted in Wikipedia, I don't know, but it said some pretty nasty things about Francis Marion. And so I'm confident that the Park Service will get over that, but that's a project. To do the project with the volunteer architects and park planners and all that are involved, and not the least of which is actually casting a bronze and designing an appropriate mounting base for it, is just under $1 million venture. And it shouldn't be that much, but it is. And so fundraising is underway now to raise the money to build that statue. At the same time, a lot of people have said, guess what? We have wonderful Marion Square in Charleston, South Carolina. We have heroic statues of other folks, starting with William Pitt in Charleston. A couple years ago, we got William Moultrie looking out across the harbor at Fort Moultrie, appropriately so. But we'd also love to see Francis Marion standing guard over Marion Square in downtown Charleston. And so I don't know exactly how the organization is on moving that project forward, but that's another one that we hope that as citizens who are educated about Marion will help us undertake to move along, because there should be, once again, a monumental statue to Francis Marion in Marion Square. Yes, ma'am.
Why not put Marion Square in Manning?
Manning politics are way out of my scope of knowledge, and I hope that they will. You know, we have a wonderful new Marion statue at, is it Witherspoon's Ferry, Doug?
No, that's what I was going to comment on. Johnsonville, you talk about raising money for a statue. This was a community, City of Johnsonville, down in eastern Lawrence County, near my home in Hemingway, which is in Williamsburg County. Raised the money, I think, in a bronze statue of Francis Marion. It's on a Venner's Landing right outside of Johnsonville, Highway 4151, going towards Florence. One way, going towards Charleston, Hemingway, Jamestown, and Charleston, another way. And it's right on the banks of the Lynch's River, supposedly right where Marion accepted his commission. But that's a community, that was grassroots. But they got money from Florence County Historical Society, and but I don't think they needed no federal money, no state money.
Okay, let me tell you where we're going to go next, if you don't mind. We've had a lot of extremely knowledgeable folks sharing the knowledge with you. Have not been a lot of questions and discussions, and one of the things that I like to do is just a round table. A round table to me means where people sit around and talk about things. And so I wanted to throw the mic to anyone who wants it to make a point or to ask a question. There is a huge amount of expertise in this room, some of which you have heard from today, and some of which are equally expert. My only request is that you try to limit your question to a minute, no more than 2, and that those who want to choose to answer the question or address it do likewise. So does anyone have something, a point or a question that they would like to ask? And you can address that to anybody here, or just throw it up like I did, toss something. Or would you rather have dessert? Carl, let me give you the mic, Carl.
I would wonder if one of the historians in the room would comment on the beginnings of the relationship or lack thereof between Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter. What created the problems initially?
Listen, the only reason I come is to defend Thomas Sumter.
And we wonder why.
You know, Thomas Sumter and Marion were peers. They were both Continental Regimental commanders, and Thomas Sumter had the unenviable assignment of going on one of the missions that came from South Carolina and Georgia, headed down to St. Augustine to attack the British. And all 3 of those missions were unsuccessful, and they were plagued by awful disorganization and ineptness in logistics, I would imagine. The logisticians would tell me that. And so Sumter resigned in 1778, and I'm sure with Marion staying true to the cause to the end as he did, that lost him some respect of Marion and other officers who did not stay the course through the war from the beginning to the end. And so I'm sure that cost some points. Then one of the things that Dave has worked so much on is working out the system in a command structure of who's in charge of who. Now, after the Civil War, the Roosevelt administration, the New Deal, 5,000 tons of congressional rules and regulations, we kind of know who's in charge now. But you got to remember the United States of America was a club. It had no authority to do much of anything, much less to tell one of these independent rebel states who didn't want to be told what to do. And so Benjamin Lincoln and Charles Lee and those guys came down here sort of in charge, but they didn't really command the local militia, and they certainly didn't command the state's navy or the state's troops. And so there's a lot of going back and forth in the correspondence over who's in charge of who and how do we handle these differences in rank. And Marion was hugely caught up in that, Sumter to a lesser extent, but there's problems over who's in command, promotions, and I'm not saying it's all ego-driven, it's practical, because if you got 3 men who are officers and they're all in one camp, and they're all telling their men to do something different, it's a disaster. And so you got to know who's in command and who's sniping and who. So there's some of that. Does anyone else want to take on the Sumter-Marion relationship? Karen, let me bring you the mic.
Well, first of all, you got to realize these men were almost neighbors. They lived pretty close together. And so there may have been something going back a long way. Sumter ran a store. It would appear he was a person who was capable of very sharp business practices, shall we say. There are many lawsuits against him involving him. In Lawrence, John Lawrence's correspondence, we find an interesting reference that I think refers to Sumter. Sumter apparently tells everybody that he fought in the Indian Wars that Marion did fight in as a provincial officer, which meant he was the closest thing that an American could be to a regular officer. He was trained by the Brits to be as professional as their officers. In the biographies I've read of Sumter, and I didn't know much about him until I read those biographies, apparently he joins the Indian Wars very late, actually sees no fighting, is promoted to a sergeant so he can go and carry the message to the Indians that the war is over. The revolution breaks out. All of the officers in the Continental Line, they have a balloting to see who's going to be the colonel and who's going to be the captain and so on and so forth. And each of the officers takes their position based upon that balloting. So Marion was balloted as a captain, and Peter Oree came in as a captain under Marion because he got less votes, and that was the way it was done, except for Sumter. Sumter went to Congress, sold Congress on the idea that he represented the backwoods, and he represented a constituency that had not been represented in his balloting, and came back from Philadelphia with a colonel's commission. Now, according to Laurens, when Congress offered Laurens a colonel's commission, because Laurens had gone up to Philadelphia and offered his services and done a lot of good services for the country and was very highly thought of by Washington, Laurens was offered a higher commission, and he refused it because he said if he got his commission that way, he knew that a lot of hard feelings would follow. So I think he was referring to the way Sumter got his commission and the hard feelings that must have occurred between all the people who stood for election, got their commission by standing in the queue and waiting their order, taking their number and waiting in line, and Sumter who jumped the line to get his commission. The other thing is apparently Sumter's Continental, was it the 6th Rangers or something that he had, was not very well disciplined or very well ordered, and that caused some problems. Sumter became a general because after his property was burned and he decided to get back into the fight, he was able to convince the backwoods militiamen that since he was had been a Continental officer, he should be the general, and they voted him to be so. So his experience in fighting was probably not what Marion and some of the other Continental officers had who had been in the Indian Wars and had seen some rather heavy fighting. And there may have been some resentment there and some feeling that Sumter did not have the experience necessary to assume the role he assumed. Of course, then there was the whole idea of the looting, of the payment of soldiers by taking property from the Tories and the Loyalists, which Marion didn't approve of. And then as things progressed, I'm sorry to say this about your friend, as things progressed, when Sumter eventually left the field because he resigned for a period of time, and this was after he had raised state troops, supposedly, under Sumter's law, where each troop was given a slave for their service. Greene sent another regular officer down to take command of the troops, and that officer reported back to Greene that the number of troops Sumter had was much less than as reported, and he stated, "I'm afraid General Sumter has played the old soldier game." Now, any of you who have ever been in the military and have worked with supply would probably know what that is, and if you weren't, then I'll explain. As a new lieutenant in the National Guard, I was asked to do an investigation on irregularities in the supply, and I heard that term for the first time, and it was explained to me that what a supply sergeant would do is he would inflate his numbers. And I said, well, why would anyone do that? Well, it's because you get paid per head for supplies, for provisions, for food and everything by how many soldiers you have. And if you are paid for 100 soldiers and you only have 50, you pocket the difference. So when they said Sumter was playing the old soldiers game, they were referring to his inflating numbers and collecting for more men than he had. So there were problems with Sumter. I don't think Marion trusted Sumter. The fact that Marion didn't trust Sumter, increased the friction between the two men. And after the war, Sumter became a Democrat-Republican, which was a states' rights guy, and Marion was a Federalist, which meant he was for a central government. So it continued.
I was a warrior's minute and a half.
The fundamental thing to add is that Sumter was born in Virginia. He was 2 years younger than Marion. And you guys may not believe it, but little petty crap like that does matter to officers. And so it's like, I'm Marion, I was born in South Carolina, I'm 2 years older than this guy, he's got better press than I got. And I'm more of a demure type of guy, and it is true, he did not like Sumter at all.
Well, maybe this is an idea for another program at another time. We've done the Sumter and Marion debate before, and there's a lot more to say about it, but I want to be more general. Do you have a different topic?
Just the fact that Marion was very good friends.
Marion was very good friends with the Canty family. And you know, Thomas Sumter married well. He married a widow with a lot of money. But anyway, she was part of the Canty family, and Marion was very, very close friends to the Canty family, and evidently was very close friends with Thomas Sumter's wife. And it is said that early on, that he would carry messages from Mrs. Sumter to Sumter. So there was some humanity there. It just didn't apply to the military, I guess.
Okay, new topic. John, let me give you the mic.
It does seem that Marion was much more humane than a lot of his peers, particularly in relation to treatment of Tories and the enemy. I wondered if anyone has any supposition or evidence as to how he treated his slaves and what his relationship was with his slaves, whether it was better than or different than any of his peers.
Anybody want to take that one?
The only way
His
to
slaves
say
were
is that
scattered,
they all
and
came
Tim
back.
came back to support him once he got back home. So I would think that if
He had 20 slaves at the beginning of the war, and the ones he didn't take with him were all scattered. But after he went back to his plantation after the war, 10 of them came out of hiding to support their previous master. And I just am suggesting that they would not have done that if he had not been reasonable.
The question then is, what happened to the other 10?
Pardon me?
What happened to the other 10 then?
I wish.
Some of them were with him.
So what, they were killed?
I don't think we really know the answer to that. There's nothing in the papers that suggests that, except that in Marion's will and in other documents, we know that he did have a faithful relationship with Buddy or Oscar. And another lady is mentioned in his, or another child actually, I think is mentioned in an earlier will. Dave, you want to add that?
I just mentioned about, he had, I don't know, like 177 or 150 of them in 1790 census.
Let's do the mic.
I think Marion had, I don't know, 150, or 170 slaves in the 1790 census, somewhere in that vicinity. In his inventory at his death, I think it was like maybe 150, but there was a letter in late 1790s, mid 1790s, where he's down at the bottom, it says, give Buddy a fiddle, and Buddy turns out to be the first named slave in his inventory, and Buddy was valued at like, I don't know, 1,000 or 700 pounds or something like that, which were $700, I can't remember, 700 pounds. But that would indicate that this fellow must have been pretty valuable to him to give him a fiddle, and he would trust this guy to get down to pick up all these supplies. So that would indicate at least there was at least one of them that he really treated well, buying him a fiddle and trusting him to take things. So That's about all I know about his slaves.
I think the other thing is that if his manservant went with him during the war, Buddy, had turned Marion over to the Brits, Buddy could have had anything he wanted. And the fact that he didn't do that shows a deep loyalty. I mean, a white guy who turned Marion over to the Brits would have had more than he ever wanted. So, I mean, Buddy would have had his freedom, and he would have a lot of money, and again, whatever he wanted. I turned up a letter from Mary Esther Vidot up in the archives up in Cambridge, related to Harvard University. And in it, she has received a letter from Julia Ward Howe's mother, and they're talking about, she writes this letter back to the relatives up north, and she brings all the slaves in, not all, but there's about 5 slaves she brings in that have been with the family for many years, and they all read the letter, and they all enjoy it, and they're all saying, hey, how you doing? And it's very, you really feel like it's a family group, that many of these slaves that were on the Marion plantation is the 3rd generation of slaves that had been with the family. So it was a very close feeling, and probably not as to some of the guys who were out working in the fields, but certainly as the house servants, and it was a very close relationship.
It's really a good example of things we'd love to know if we had a good time machine, but unfortunately the documentation doesn't tell you much. No, you talk. Anybody? Okay. All right, are you ready for dinner? Okay. All right, thank y'all so much for humoring the discussion. And George has given us the time signal, and we'll stand down.